Okay, so now let's talk about pensions. Now hang in there, this will be a long problem because it's one full pension problem with a lot of moving pieces. So we'll work together to get this finished. So where do we begin? Well, when we're talking about pensions, we have to remember the three primary components. Well, before we do that actually, let's talk about that this is a defined benefit plan, not a defined contribution plan. When you have a defined benefit plan, the employer is bearing the risk. So they have to ensure that there's enough funds in the actual plans to help meet that future obligation to our employees when they retire. So really the employers are on the hook here, so to speak. So when we talk about that, again, back to those things, what are the primary components of a defined benefit plan? Well, first off, you've got the PBO, which is the projected benefit obligation. Again, that's the amount we project in current dollars that we'll have to pay out in the future. We need to have enough in that account or in our plan assets, the second piece, in order to cover that PBO in the future. And then the last thing is the pension expense. That's the annual expense that we must record as an associated cost of the pension plan. Now, before we really get into this problem, let's look at our worksheet here. The easiest way to complete a pension problem is to really use a worksheet. So if you'll just sort of get a worksheet in your mind, and every time you have to do a pension plan problem, use that type of worksheet. So what goes in there? Well, one, we have the three components: pension expense, the projected benefit obligation, and the plan assets. In addition, we have the offsets to things that create changes in those. So let's first define all of the items that cause changes in the three primary components of our pension plan. Let's start with the projected benefit obligation. There are 5 things that really impact the projected benefit obligation that we'll see throughout this problem. 1, the service cost. The service cost is actually the cost of one more year of benefit. So our employees completed another year of working. That's the cost that associated with all those employees that actually finished that year. The second thing that goes into the actual PBO, and again, PBO is always projected benefit obligation, is the interest cost. The interest cost is the cost of the debt. Remember, projected benefit obligation is debt to our employees in the future. Well, debt bears interest. So that is going to be the interest cost. We always find that by taking the amount of the PBO that's going to bear interest and multiplying it by some defined rate given to us typically by the actuary. Okay? Now, what's the third component? Well, the third component is called prior service cost adjustments. That is a component of our PBO. What is that? Well, a prior service cost adjustment occurs when the company alters their pension formula. In other words, let's say in the past we've offered 1.5% of the employee's salary. Well, maybe based on executive decision or whatever, we decide that 1.7% going forward. Well, that's retroactive. That changes our overall PBO in total because of prior year service. So that creates what we call a prior service cost adjustment. Okay. Then the fourth thing that's going to be part of this is any actuarial gains or losses. Okay. Let's go back and fix that. I missed an A there. There we go. Actuarial gains and losses on the PBO. Now, what is that? Well, what creates that is when we look at a pension formula, we have a few things that go into that pension formula. One, we already know the 1.5 or the 1.7% we talked about a moment ago that we agreed to pay our employees. But then we need to know the number of years of service that we expect our employees to work, and we need to sort of estimate their final salary, so to speak, in some form or fashion. Both of those can change throughout time. So the formula we use today, the number of service years we anticipate, and the final salary could change in any given year. So when that happens, that creates those actuarial gains or losses on our PBO. The other thing that could happen, all of this has to be brought back to present value. Remember, we're not going to pay pensions, say you work for 40 years. Well, yes, I'm accruing an obligation to you, but that's 40 years out from now. And then once you retire in 40 years, as an example, you're going to maybe live 20 years after that or draw pensions 20 years after that. So there's a lot of moving pieces there. So we have to bring that back because I don't need $1 million today to pay you $1 million 50 years from now. I need to bring that back to today. So we're talking present value. So any change in the rates to calculate present value of those creates actuarial gains or losses on PBO. So that goes into the part of the obligation if we have any of those types of changes. And then the last thing that really goes into the PBO is the benefits paid. And that's probably the easiest one. That simply means we've taken plan assets and paid retirement to our employees that have retired. That actually reduces our obligation because every time we pay an employee a payment, we no longer owe them that benefit, so it reduces the amount we owe there. So that's the 5 components that make up the projected benefit obligation. Now, let's talk about the next piece, and that's the plan assets. We talk about the plan assets, there's actually 4 components that go into plan assets. One we've already talked about, benefits paid. When you pay down on the obligation, that payment comes from the plan assets. So your plan assets are going to go down. Once we talk about plan assets, the next thing is the expected return on the plan assets. Now the expected return is what the actuary expected that we would get on the pension assets with the rate of return. So for example, you put money in a savings account, it could say 3% per year. That's your expected return. Maybe rates went up in the year, so it went up to 4% in the year. All of a sudden you've got a 4% actual return. So there's a difference there. So when we talk about plan assets, we talk about benefits paid. We're talking about expected return on assets. Then we also have to adjust that expected to actual. In our last one, a moment ago, we talked about how the rate went from 3 to 4 and we got a 4% actual return. Well, our expected rate of return was 3, so we're going to have to write that up by 1% to 4% to show the actual return on plan assets. You could also go the other way. We could have anticipated 3, rates went down to 2, so we had less of a return. So we got the expected and then we've got the actual. Keep in mind that the actual rate of return here, though, is writing up or down the expected return. So if we expected 3 and we got 4, we would do 3% here and that extra 1% here. We wouldn't do a 3 and a 4 because that's saying 7% in total. So we do the difference in the actual to bring the expected return either up to actual return or down to actual return, depending on if we got a greater rate of return than expected or a lower rate of return. Okay, and then the last thing that goes into our plan assets are contributions into those assets. Every now and then the company will take cash and put that cash into the plan assets to increase the balance there. So contributions are simply money that we're putting out of our normal operating budget and moving those assets into the plan assets to cover future costs. Okay, so that's the 4 things right there that impact our actual plan assets. Okay, benefits paid does overlap because those 5 impact our PBO. Then the last thing we have to talk about is the pension expense. There's 5 things that go into calculation of the pension expense. One is the service cost. So I'm going to put a little asterisk next to each of those. So service cost, the interest cost also impacts our pension expense. The next thing that's going to be involved in pension expense calculations is the expected return. And then the last 2 items. Anytime we have this prior service cost, we have actuarial gains or losses, things of that nature, we do not have to recognize them immediately, so we're going to amortize those items over the remaining service life of our employees. So say you have a prior service cost of 15. We don't have to all of a sudden take a hit in your pension expense for that 15. We're allowed to take that 15 because say we're not going to actually pay that out for 10 more years. So instead of hitting 15 all at once, we'd simply allocate that 15 over a 10-year period. So $1,500 a month instead of a $15,000 hit up front. Because we understand in pensions, we're not really taking that hit right now. It's to a future obligation, so we can amortize it. But that is part of the cost of the pension. So the amortization of the prior service cost is one piece of pension expense that does not go into the PBO or the plan assets. And the last thing I just said, like these actuarial gains and losses, for example, are also amortized over the life because, again, we're not taking all that at one point in time. We do calculate those a little differently with a corridor test, and we'll actually do the corridor test in this problem we're going to look at. So that's called the amortization of the gains or losses. Okay, I'm going to use G and L because we're running out of time. So that's a good starting point. So now we've got this completed sort of chart. so that we can accurately calculate our obligation here in a few moments. So in video 2 that I'm going to post, we'll actually start this problem. I think we're getting at 10 minutes here, so I'm going to pause this one so that now we've talked about the 3 components and all the items that make up projected benefit obligation, the plan assets, and the annual pension expense. In video 2, we'll start working this problem and we'll work through 2018. And then in video 3, we'll go through and we'll go from 2018 to 2019.